Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Morpheus Ravenna is a gender-fluid sorcerer, artist, and writer residing in the East Bay area of California. She is a dedicant of the Morrigan with a practice rooted in animism, folk magic, and Celtic polytheism. An initiate of the Anderson Fairy tradition of witchcraft, she has practiced devotional polytheism and magical arts for over 25 years. She's the author of the Book of the Great Queen and the upcoming The Magic of the Otherworld, and the priest and co-founder of the Koru priesthood. Morpheus makes her living as a tattoo artist, and she creates devotional artworks and sorceress crafts in a variety of media. She also practices medieval armored combat and is very fond of spears. Morpheus can be reached through her website at bansheearts.com. Morpheus Ravenna, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you on and excited to talk tattoo and spears and writing and witchcraft and all those good things with you. But our first question for everybody on the show is, in this era of so many other ways to communicate digitally and visually, why write? Why still write books?
Yeah. I didn't start out as a writer. I am an artist first. But I suppose I became a writer because the book that I really wanted didn't exist yet. And the book that a lot of people were asking for didn't exist yet. My first book, The Book of the Great Queen, when I started writing it, there were not very many books for pagans and polytheists about the Morrigan. There was scholarship material from academia, and there was like one or two pagan books that were just not very comprehensive and didn't really present much of the lore in Irish literature that she emerges from. And so there was sort of like this gap. I realized that I had been collecting all of this, lore and notes and kind of a treasure trove of information, and that was what was actually needed, was to turn that into a book. So yeah, I do think of myself as an artist first. But once I got through that process of writing that first book, I found that I had more to share. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that idea of, if you think that you basically write the book you want to see on the shelf, right? That's kind of the experience. And it is funny to me, like, I think a lot of people who practice in the occult space, whatever label they use, do become kind of magpies of information. Like we traditionally we have this idea of the grimoire or the Book of Shadows or all that. So we're kind of wired to do that anyway. And then, that kind of sets you up to write a book if that's what you want to do later. So.
Yeah, it's true. And I sort of have the Scrivener of Shadows, I suppose.
I love that. The Scrivener of Shadows. Perfect.
Yeah.
Probably not in their marketing material, but maybe should be.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of how I get started with a project, is I start collecting all of these, shiny treasures of lore and information. Like I'll start taking notes when I'm reading, and I put all those notes into my Scrivener, and I love to tag them, and so I can search, like, what do I have on this topic, and find everything. And then that becomes kind of the wellspring that I am drawing from when I'm trying to write.
Yeah, I really admire people who use Scrivener and get what they want out of it. I attempted to use Scrivener and did not have a good experience. I'm still very analog in my note taking, which is sometimes a detriment when you have stacks of it. But Scrivener is a really powerful tool if you can make it work for you.
Yeah.
And people who are listening who don't know what Scrivener is, it is basically a word processor for writers, I guess, application for
Right.
writers. So, and has
Yeah, I know, and people have different feelings about it. They sort of love it or they hate it. I love it because I just love being able to have this like beautifully tagged, searchable file of bits of information I've collected. I almost feel like that's more powerful than the actual writing.
yeah. I mean, I think that basically digital index card
Yeah.
file system is basically, I think, the strength of it. Yeah, no, I agree. I
Yeah,
don't
so
even
that's
have
my
index
little like
cards. I just have,
magpie.
yeah, I don't even have index cards anymore though. I just have stacks of books with flags in them, which is sometimes not helpful. So it's I gotta come up with a better system. But so I guess we talked a little bit before and talked about your first book coming out with an independent press or small press. So what was
Mhm.
that? What was that experience versus now getting published with a bigger occult press?
Yeah, so my first book is through Crescent Press, which is a small niche, basically one-man publishing house. It's operated by my friend Sam Webster. And, what I love about that, and I'm still working with him on other projects, um, is it's very intimate. There's a lot more input for me in terms of like what is the book going to look like. Um, what kind of choices are we making in how the material is designed? So like with a larger publishing house, you don't really have as much of a voice in that. Um, yeah, so I would say like it's more relationship based. It's almost more collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on the other side of that, you kind of have to do all of your own marketing for the most part. As a tiny niche publishing house, they aren't able to offer as much support in terms of like publicists, sending information about you, setting up different formats, audiobooks, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's intimate, it's relationship oriented, and it's collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Yeah.
yeah, so this new book, The Magic of the Otherworld, is with Llewellyn. It's a different experience. um, it's there's kind of like all of this wider support for getting it out there in a much broader way. It's going to be on radar for all kinds of bookstores because it's in these big catalogs and stuff. Um, but the process of producing the book is sort of like it's happening in this office somewhere, and every once in a while I'll get an email about it.
Yeah.
I might get to ask for certain things about, what's the cover going to look like or whatever, but mostly those processes are happening without me.
Yeah. So the illustration, I have the e-galley, but it does have illustrations in it. Those are your illustrations in the book?
Yeah. I think that's unusual, but they decide to use my illustrations for the book. I think it's not typical, but because I had, designed all of these sigils to go with the book that are, introducing and for invoking spirits that are introduced in the book. And I had created these sigil illustrations that are basically portraits of these different spirits and deities that are related to the work that have their sigil integrated into the image.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to make a case that like these kind of belong with the book. Yeah, I'm grateful that they were willing to let me do that. So the illustrations in that book are mine in The Magic of the Otherworld.
Yeah, I really I think I just enjoyed that and loved that, the idea of the sigil in this portrait, like you said, kind of approach. So it was really nice to have this visual aspect to it as you're reading through. And if anyone decides to get this as an ebook, it transfers really well in the ebook. Because sometimes illustrations are wonky, in ebooks, and it works really well the way they have it laid out. But I guess it's a good opportunity to kind of segue into talking about like what the book is about and kind of the seed for this book, and just have at it. Like, tell us about the book. So.
Yeah. Well, I obviously I'm a witch as well as a polytheist, devotional practitioner. And I included some magical practice information in one of the chapters in the Book of the Great Queen. And immediately I started hearing from people, is there more of this material? So, there's like the one chapter about sorcery that is about, the Morrigan's relationship to sorcery and what kind of, what can we take from that? And people immediately started asking me to expand on that. And so I became aware that there was just sort of like this great hunger out there for a Celtic polytheist approach to magic and sorcery that, is not necessarily reconstructionist, but is sort of rooted in the Lauren tradition, and to tools for people to build a sorcery practice that sort of aligns with Celtic polytheism, or sort of fits within that. So people started asking me, do you have more of this material? Can you teach it? Can you write more about it? And I began doing workshops. I did a series of workshops at various, conferences and festivals, and I did a couple iterations of them online. Just, Celtic sorcery series, like putting together the pieces of this kind of practice that I had developed in a format that I could share with people. And then I started to realize that workshop series, that material could easily translate to a book, and began putting it together for that.
Mm-hmm. And I one of the things I really enjoyed reading the book, we joked before we started that I kind of had to speed run it, but well, there's several things I really like about it. One of them I really like is that you have very clear scope for this book. This is not, here's everything about Celtic practice witchcraft deities from time immemorial to modern practice. Like, you have a clear scope of the book, which it seems very smart approach to me because books are finite, right? I mean, you got to have some, you got to have limits between those covers. And you share personal stories of your practice, which I think adds to reading the book. One of the things I very quickly picked up on is your voice in this book is like listening to a trusted friend tell you something. Like, you just have this very reassuring, measured, it's not even about like the confidence of the voice or anything. It's just like, yes, this person is being completely transparent with you, and it shows in the way that you write, which I thought was just lovely and just enjoyed reading. So,
well, thanks. Yeah, I do feel humble about presenting this material, and kind of was striving to bring that forward. I have a lot of experience in these practices. I've been, doing this and developing this for couple decades and more. But at the same time, I'm very aware that, my perspective on it and my experience of it is, it emerges from my particular world and set of experiences, and it's not the totality. And particularly when you get into anything Celtic or anything that where that word comes up, there are a lot of different ways that people understand that and approach it and have different feelings about, anything that you might call Celtic. And we touched on this before the show. And so I feel like it's important to kind of be humble and to be cautious and to be thoughtful about how I approach that and how I present that, particularly, as somebody in the diaspora, like I wasn't born and raised in one of the Gaelic countries. So I am coming to this as part of the diaspora and kind of needing to, just, be humble and be cautious about how I present myself and what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, I don't, I'm probably going to step in something, but I'm going to try and say this as gracefully as I probably can, as I possibly can, is that I feel like it's easy, especially as, white American folks who often have Gaelic country ancestors to say,
Yeah.
I can't culturally appropriate this because it's mine. And I'm like, but you don't live there. Like it's ancestry is not culture. It's not the same thing. And I think that it's real easy for us to forget that. And one of the things I do appreciate about the book is that you talk about cultural appropriation in a very like not finger waggy way, but like this is really something we have to think about across all of our practices and what we do. And that so much of what you're talking about is rooted in things that we can know, either through scholarly writing or, the writings of the early church in Ireland. It's for anyone who loves a bibliography, your book has a great bibliography. There's a lot of info there and a lot of rabbit trails to go down. But also you use Gaelic languages. I mean, you talk about, this is what this sounds like in Gaelic, and this is the translation. And I think that to me is sometimes a piece we miss. I mean, I've been studying German partly to reconnect to my ancestors and partly because I'm interested in Germanic practice, but I want to be really careful about where I step because we all know where the potholes are there, right? So, I think it's, including that piece of language to me seems really important.
Yeah, it is. And, as much as I sort of fall into the well and I love to look at the poetry and the language and what's being said, what are all the embedded layers of meaning, that feels really powerful to me. But I'm also still not like a fluent speaker of Irish, or, Gaulish or any of the Celtic languages. But I spend a lot of time with them. I spend a lot of time with the early Irish literature material. I spend a lot of time with an old Irish dictionary. And those kind of resources, and just sort of like delving into what are all the layers that this reveals. And I think like that becomes really important with this material because some of the English translations that we have were done by like Victorian dudes. And they're not great.
I mean, some of those translations,
you're always bringing your biases to it, and they definitely brought theirs.
I was gonna say sometimes their lenses were a little occluded in how they approach those things. And and also like I think it's important, and you do this really beautifully in the book, is to touch on, like with the Christianization of the Gaelic countries, Ireland has this unique place of the Irish church where so much practice was pulled forward. And I have joked about having source amnesia on the show, but I really do have it. And I can't remember where it comes from that, basically paganism in Ireland didn't disappear. It was just swallowed by the church. And you can still see the outlines in the snake kind of thing. And, I think that's important to remember that a lot of what we think of as Christian practice, especially the Irish church, is interpreted in some ways, was pulled from earlier practices.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I understand these processes is like, conversion in these kind of situations tends to start at the top, and so like you have in the medieval period, the rulers and the kind of power structure has adopted Christianity, and that doesn't necessarily mean that like your neighbor isn't still, talking to the land and talking to the old gods and doing whatever is going to like make sure that the crop doesn't fail. And that persists, like at the folk practice level, it persists a lot longer than it does at the level of the power elite. because, the power elite, like, they have kind of a vested interest in absorption into institutions of power, right? And so, like, the church can align itself with that. But at the folk practice level, people do what they do. And that stuff persists, and I would argue has persisted. It becomes integrated with folk religion, folk Catholicism, and mostly in the case of Ireland, or whatever the religion is in the country you're talking about, like those folk magic practices and folk pagan practice get absorbed into people's everyday experience of religion. And so they never disappeared. Like in Ireland, that stuff never disappeared. It just became part of folk practice that is both pagan and Catholic in a sense. It might be a misnomer to call those things pagan anymore, but they certainly have that root, and you can see the through line. Certain practices like circumnavigating wells and doing devotional and ritual practices around wells, or around certain standing stones in the landscape, those kind of things. Like, you can actually trace all the way from like the earliest medieval manuscripts all the way through to the present day. Some of those practices are consistent. And
it's funny to me because I always find it amusing when you see evidence of these continuing practices in the sermons and in the things where they're basically railing against people doing stuff. It's like, well, if they were
sort of tells you.
If they were, if there was admonition about don't do this, then people were still doing it.
It's not good for people to listen to the voices of birds. Stop listening to omens.
Oops. Yeah. No, I do love that. And I've been working on a nonfiction project and looking at some older texts, and just the number of times they're like, yeah, well, the pagans are still doing this, so we have to tell them not to, or we have to figure out a way to incorporate it into what we're doing. So they'll stop.
Yeah. It's amazing how conservative folk memory is. And I say that in the sense of it preserves things, it holds things and passes them down and transmits them. And, there's some evolution over time, but like those core things, they really persist. And that is a feature of folk memory that you see in indigenous cultures as well. They can have traditions that preserve, real historical information or knowledge that is of concrete meaning and applies to the world, that is passed down sort of intact for millennia.
Well, and I think, if anyone has any doubt that process happened in ancient and medieval and early modern times, all you really have to do now is look at urban legend and children's songs, like playground songs, and you see it. I mean, it's just, there's modern evidence that that's how humans behave. So, which I don't know, that is a whole other level of fascination. But I think one of the other aspects that you bring out about Celtic practice in all of these different cultures is how important poetry and like the bardic tradition was in these oral cultures. And how that still shows up. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Touching on the poetry again. I think, that aspect of it is kind of hard for us as, like modern, very book-oriented people to adjust to. But in the material that these traditions originate from, at that time it was an oral culture, like, before the advent of Christianity, and the kind of literate, tradition in Ireland. It was an oral culture, and that oral tradition persisted even, after the introduction of the book. And so like you'll see these descriptions of like the recitation of lore that was still being done at like community gatherings. And I think into the storytelling tradition, you know,
Mhm.
that continues. That's one of those through lines. Yeah, and then, just like there's a very, very rich vein of poetics that are there in this tradition. And they, like in the medieval period, they have identified all these different like poetic meters and structures and patterns of poetry. And mastery as a poet in the bardic tradition was about being able to compose in all of these different meters. um it's interesting, like the word for a poetic meter is the same as a word for magic or a spell, bricht,
Mhm.
which I think is really interesting. And there's like, there's this ritual that gets described for like how to remove a king if he has, violated his oaths or whatever. And it's 7 poets, each of which is reciting poetry in a different meter. Like all 7 of these important poetic meters are being employed at the same time. Which kind of implies this idea that like the different poetic meters have a certain power to them. Um, yeah, so there's a lot there about like the power of poetry and poetics. And um, there seems to be this understanding that like if you had mastery of the ability to compose poetry in that way, that opens a channel for, the
Mhm.
other world, the numinous, to be speaking through you.
Yeah. Yeah. I do love the idea that a different meter has a different purpose magically.
Yeah,
I mean, that to me is fascinating. And I think,
it is.
as predominantly English speakers, we sometimes, and maybe this is true for other people in their native language, I think we forget about the power of actual words sometimes. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, because I do think there is this, I always say, there's this like everybody wants to do their spells in Latin, right? And I was like, well, things existed before Latin. I mean, like there are
Yeah.
languages that existed before Latin. It's not the oldest language we know. And, why is there less power in English if you know the roots of those words and understand that than there is in Latin?
Yeah, it's an interesting, that's like the barbarous incantations thing, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
somehow it feels more powerful to us if it is recited in a language that isn't English or it
Mm-hmm.
isn't our daily language. I
Mm-hmm.
think partly that's about like stepping into something outside of your ordinary consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So in part that's about making that shift from kind of ordinary reality to ritual space, ritual reality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, I think, there's something that Irish poetry does that I think is maybe harder for English to do, about the way that words alliterate and echo each other.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just that I'm not an accomplished poet. I've seen, um, friends that study poetry and practice this type of poetry do really magical things with English.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's some really cool stuff that shows up in the poetry in Irish, where like words that alliterate and sort of evoke the sound of another word allow you to almost have like an unspoken layer of the
Mm-hmm.
poem that like if you were as a native speaker listening to it, those sounds would evoke other things. It's kind of hard to explain, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think you do. I think you do a good job. And it's very similar to how you explained it in the book that there's, um, I think English, we have this idea, I think, because a lot of spells and chants and things in English are written with end rhyme in very
mm-hmm.
specific meter. And those meters in end rhyme aren't really native to English. They're native to Romance languages. because English doesn't have a lot of words that rhyme on the end the same way that Romance languages do. So we kind of adopted that in English, which I think is why sometimes when people talk about, oh, this sounds silly, when you talk about chants in English that rhyme on the end, because English was really kind of more meant to have internal rhyme and blank verse and alliteration. And so I think we've lost some of that ability to do that in English because we have these imposed forms from Romance languages on English that came from the French
also,
and Latin
I feel
and
like,
all that.
Yeah. I feel like a factor there also is that where people have spent much time, like the average person that is maybe not, working with poetry a lot, where they remember hearing that is like nursery rhyme children's stuff.
Right.
And that's why it registers that way as like silly, because, maybe it evokes like children's rhymes.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a level to which like our society is not saturated in poetry the way that early Ireland was, right? Like, every important occasion there would be recitation of poetry, like legal judgments were given in poetry. And so like there's a dignity to that we sort of have lost because we don't make poetry important in our society.
Yeah. And poets are largely writing for other poets, right? I mean, there's not a wider, not a huge audience for poetry, sadly, because I think you're right. I think and there is, even in English, we have like a poetic register too. Like we think about poetic language in English, and sometimes it's archaic, and sometimes it's, it's the meter and the tone and all of those things. But it's, I don't know, language fascinating. I mean, obviously, as a writer, language fascinates me. But it's just one of those things I think can be such an integral layer to practice. Either like you said, like you've done in the book, and using like actually the Irish language to talk about how to do these incantations and spells and the meaning behind that, and to study it, not just for the sound, but to understand what they were really trying to say differently than what a translation might tell you. And then to also think about how to bring that into your own language, when you compose things yourself, like what is the meaning behind that? And I think in the section on where you've talked about the alphabet meaning kind of divination system you set up, that we don't think about where does our alphabet come from? Like we do runes and we do Ogham and we do witches runes, and
but we have decided that the Roman alphabet is not magical.
Right. And I'm like, maybe there's magic there too, people.
What if there is?
Yeah. I mean, because those letters came from thought forms as well. So.
Well, and ultimately they trace to similar origins. Like if you go way back, like, like the Germanic runes and the Gaulish letter system and a bunch of other alphabets, ultimately, like they go back to these early italic scripts, like Etruscan, those kind of things. They sort of have like, and the Latin alphabet is connected to that whole sort of family. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Although I really want to meet like a modern practitioner who's using like cuneiform in their witchcraft. Like I would love to meet that person. I'm sure they're out there somewhere, and I want to meet them.
People probably do, right? Like, there are Sumerian and Babylonian polytheists. Maybe they're using cuneiform.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
There was something I wanted to mention too, like just rolling back a second when talking about using, language and poetry and speech, that I wanted to touch on, like, even apart from like whether you're trying to use Old Irish in your rituals or not, I think there's something really powerful about actually speaking words aloud in a ritual context that we sometimes, skip over. There is a power in actually speaking your prayers and your charms out loud. And I feel like there can be a tendency to not bother to say it aloud if you're working alone. because, like the gods can hear me even if I just say it in my mind, right?
Right.
But speaking words with your body is different than speaking them with your mind. And there is this whole notion of like the breath is a vehicle for power and life force. And so actually sending your words on your breath, shaping them with your mouth, making them heard in the air, there's a whole embodied magical process happening there that it's not happening if you are just speaking words in your mind. And some of the Irish tradition talks about this, like there's this idea that comes up again and again that like a wish or an intention that you can vocalize in one breath, like in the space of one breath, can have this sort of extra power that makes it come to pass or to be true or come into being. Yeah, so I think there's a power there.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think about it like even, in reading texts, when you're reading prayers, or to me, it's not the same reading it as if you were to speak it out loud. Like
Yeah,
I can read it and it doesn't activate the magic somehow. I don't really know exactly how to encapsulate what I want to say, but it also made me think, Dr. Alexander Cummins was on the show really early, and I've taken some classes with him and talking about like in the grimoire tradition, like there are instructions like before you speak the prayers to put like incense in your mouth, like actually perfume your breath before you speak the prayers, like to put frankincense under your tongue or something before you speak these words.
Wow.
And so I think, that idea of the power of breath, I always hate to say things are universal. It's a wide held, let's just say it's widely held that the breath is magical in and of itself, an instrument of magic.
Because one thing that every culture has in common is that people are experiencing this in a human body.
Right.
And some things are transcultural because they pertain to what it is like to exist in a flesh bag on the earth,
Exactly. Like we all have that experience of being human and the wonders and foibles of the human body. So
yeah.
No, I do really like that a lot. So what else would you like to share about the book and about writing and think anything that bubbles up that I want to talk about this?
I guess about writing, I will say that getting through a book as big as the Book of the Great Queen, it really helped me transform my relationship to writing from one of like being inspired to one of being productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And actually, this applies to any creative discipline, really. And I have also found it as an artist, when you're a tattoo artist, you have to produce art for people on a schedule. And so one of the sort of really powerful things that has been very helpful to me is to make that shift from creativity as something that sort of magically happens to you, and it's like either the muse is there or it's not, or inspiration hits you or it's not, and you can only create if inspiration has hit you. Making the shift from that to this like boots under the desk, like I'm going to create now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And creativity as a discipline, basically, where it's like you're not at the mercy of how you're feeling that day. You are going to sit down and do work. Mm-hmm. And, if you're not having a high inspiration day, the work that you do that day might not be the top of what the line of what you can produce, but it's work that goes into the bigger, project.
Right.
And I think one of the things that, I don't know, was a revelation for me is that sticking your boots under the desk and sitting yourself down to work, even if you aren't feeling particularly creative, actually how you start the engine.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I
it's
do think
like
that is
not
important.
passively waiting for the moment to happen, but actually like approaching creativity as a discipline. And this has been
Mhm.
really helpful to me in my art practice, in my writing practice, just in everything.
How is that the muse is more likely to strike you if she knows where you're sitting, kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like it's good to do that. And I think there is, you know, one of the things lots of people who've come on the show to talk about, and lots of people I know just in my personal life as writers, is like, no two writers have the same process or the same, like everybody kind of gets to this work in their own way. But I do think consistency is a commonality. And that consistency may be that you only write on the weekends. It may not be that you write every day, that writers write every day. Some people can't do that. They are raising small children. They have a 12-hour workday. There's all of these reasons why every day may not happen for you, but that you have some consistency. It's like I write on Saturdays
Mm-hmm.
or I write every day, or just to have some idea of that. And I'm currently in the middle of unpacking my house, so writing has not been happening. And I
Yeah.
notice when I don't have my consistent practice, I start to get weird. It's like, the
Yeah.
outlet of
Yeah.
writing is also important for me, not just the action of it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. For me, that consistency has been really helpful. And I started scheduling writing time
mm-hmm.
when I was working on my first book, and I sort of just never stopped.
Yeah.
It's helpful for me to have like a substantial block of time. Like my preferred thing is to just like one day a week, I block out from everything else, and I try not to have appointments or distractions or whatever. Instead of like, 1 hour every day before or after my day job, that would never work for me because it takes me a little while to like sink my teeth back into my project.
Yeah.
And then I need to have like a little block of time to like get up to speed and really get going on it.
Mm-hmm.
But having that consistently blocked out time where like I know I'm just not going to put appointments on that day. Whatever that cycle is for a person, whether that's like, certain hours every day or certain days or whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
just having that be like a commitment that you've made to yourself. Like this is the day I've given myself to
Yeah.
be able to do that.
Well, and I
That's
think
been
it
really
honors,
helpful for me.
yeah, and it honors the importance of the work, right? If it's something that's important to you, then it's important to say this time is for that thing, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
is. If it's your art, if it's your writing, sex with your partner, I
Yeah.
mean, whatever it is, it's important to say, yes, we make time to do this because it's important for this reason. And
Yeah. And I don't know how I'm going to feel that day, but I'm going to show up and put my boots under the desk and something will get done.
yeah, yeah, something. And
Chip
sometimes it's,
away at this big project.
I was gonna say, and sometimes it's not writing for me. Sometimes it's like I just read through what I've written and figure out where I go
Mm-hmm.
next. Like if the actual words on paper don't happen, there's still the work of moving forward in the piece that I'm
Yeah.
working on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those days are frustrating
Just
because I'm like,
spending
I feel like I
time.
just read my own words and I hate them for 2 hours, but sometimes you got to do that. So, did you find like moving from considering yourself an artist to writer, was there like I guess a moment of like, who am I to do writing, like imposter syndrome stuff that came with making that transition, or no?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I started out writing a blog before I decided to try to write a book. Um, and I kind of knew that I was working my way up to something bigger, but it felt like I don't even know how people do something as big as a book, so I don't know where to start.
Yeah.
So I started with writing, shorter pieces. And I suppose like that is also why I start with the magpie phase, that we talked about earlier of the collecting all the bits, because I feel like gathering all that material and then sort of laying it out in front of myself helps me to figure out what my orientation is to this concept or material, and what is the thing that I have to say about it. I definitely still get the imposter syndrome. I think that all creative people, or most creative people, struggle with that. But I'm also very familiar with it.
Yeah.
Because as an artist, the same thing comes up. So I have a very particular relationship to that voice, that imposter voice. I have sort of spent a lot of time getting to know it. I suppose I could say, like, at this point, we're friends.
Yeah. I know that's good to make friends with that. Yeah. It took me a really long time to introduce myself as a writer first. And I think the first time, they always say no one can bonk you on the head with a magic wand and say you're an artist, you're a writer. You kind of have to claim it yourself. And my husband introduced me to someone as a writer. And it just, like, there was this moment of like, yeah, that didn't feel weird. Like, it wasn't magical or anything. It was just like, yeah, that didn't feel weird for someone else to say it. Like, that means it's probably true. And I was like,
yeah,
okay.
I mean, I think the thing is just like, there's a quote somewhere on the internet from, I think, Neil Gaiman, where he's answering a question from somebody about how do you become a writer. And he's like, well, you begin writing and then you don't stop.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And now, presto, you're a writer, right?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the thing is just to not stop making, not stop creating, just not stop.
Yeah.
However you feel about it, however the doubts that you have, just make more art is, like, always the answer.
Yeah.
It also helped me to actually, like, stop trying to shut down my imposter syndrome voice, that like doubting voice. Instead, actually have a conversation with it. And what I came to realize is, like, the imposter syndrome, that is a product of us recognizing the difference between what we are capable of producing at a current skill level and what we can imagine being able to produce.
Yeah.
Or what the people we admire are producing. Right. And so our awareness of that distance, or that gap between what we'd like to be able to do and what we can imagine being able to do and what we're currently able to do, that's where that comes from. It's like, it's aspirational, actually. And if we can sort of sit with that and have a conversation with it, you can maybe give yourself permission to be where you are now and say, like, it's okay that I am at this place now in my creative arc, even though I can see that place over there I'd like to get to. The way I'm going to get there is just by keeping on doing what I'm doing and doing the best I can do, and making more art. And I don't know, that was sort of liberating for me.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And I think one of the things for me, kind of, that one of those realizations for me was that I can have an idea right now of something I want to do, and I'm not ready to come to that idea. I have it, but I need to do some other stuff first before I'm ready to tackle that project or that piece. And then that's okay. And, I will continue to work on these other things, and then I will, work up to where I feel like I'm ready to do this thing. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like, it's helpful to see yourself as on a creative arc, a developmental arc in your creative practice, that, you're going to continue to learn more and develop your skills throughout your life. And so, it's not that you're a failure if you aren't at the pinnacle, because, everybody has an arc. And the people that are at that pinnacle of accomplishment, they got there somehow. They had a pathway that they had to climb up to get there. And you're on that pathway. You just keep going. You just keep going.
And I think it is one of those things where it's almost like, what we appreciate, like you said, in art and writing, and those people that are at the pinnacle are taste almost. And where we are, it's really easy to compare yourself, like your process, to their completion. And it's like, their process is messy too. You just don't get you don't
Yeah.
have the privilege of experiencing that. And I've heard
Yep.
so many writers talk about, like I'm writing my 10th book and I still am halfway through it going, I don't know how to do this. How do I write a book?
Yeah.
Like it's everything, every project has its own course too. And sometimes
Yeah.
those courses are easy and sometimes they're really difficult. So
I also think that like there's something about like if you're pushing yourself creatively, you're gonna be near those edges and you're gonna be sometimes working on a thing that you're not sure you know how to complete, right? Like that's powerful. That means you're pushing yourself creatively and you're at your boundary and you're moving your boundary further. There's an amazing quote from David Bowie talking about this where he says like the best place to, I'm paraphrasing, but he says basically like the best place to be creatively is where you feel slightly out of your depth and not sure that your feet are going to touch bottom. And that's where you're going to do magical things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's from an interview. Like, I think I've seen the clip of the interview of him saying that and was just like, yeah, no, he gets it.
Yeah.
Definitely. Cool. Well, like I said, we try to keep episodes to an hour, and I always feel like I could just talk forever with folks. But
same.
Like I'm also like I understand that attention spans. Like me as a podcast listener, if it's more than an hour, I look at it twice before I start. So I try to keep them short. But one of the things I want to do before we get to our last question, which is our tiny game of chance, I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug what's coming for you, like what's on the horizon for you. And I can tell you when this episode is going to air. So you can think about that in terms of that. It'll air toward the end of August. So, so what, what's on the horizon for you? Where can people find you? What's going on?
Yeah. So, I have a new chapbook out through Concrescent Press that is a litany of the Morigna, which is it's 100 names and epithets drawn from the Irish lore with sort of commentary and background and about the translations and what they tell us about them. And then, of course, I have The Magic of the Otherworld out from Llewellyn. In terms of things that are coming up, I'm putting my head forward into August.
For folks listening, we are recording this in May, so it's a little bit out there for both of us. So
I will be tattooing at a couple of things this summer and fall. I'm going to be tattooing at the Koru Priesthood's gathering in August. It's called a hosting at the Morrigan's Hearth. And then I will be down in Austin in November tattooing and doing ritual tattoo. And then in terms of where people can find me, I'm at bansheearts.com. That's my main website and everything's linked from there. You can find my social medias and stuff. Awesome.
Well, great. So our last question, and you with your Southeastern roots may know about the admonition not to talk about certain things in polite company, although I've never quite figured out what polite company is exactly, or who that pertains to. Because I'm like, well, I like to talk about these things. And some people would say that women are polite company. And I'm like, well, no, we're not. So I will roll a die, and depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And I do try to make it related to your writing or what you've talked about in the book. So it's not like a one, it's not, I'm not trying to do a gotcha question. Although occasionally they do surprise people. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which question you want. So,
okay,
let's see what we get. For politics. Shocking.
Yeah.
We didn't really touch on that, but one of the things that you share in the book, and I think it was really powerful for me, was you touch on your pastoral care work with survivors of intimate partner violence. And I think one of the things that sometimes gets left out of the conversation about being a witch in the world is how important our work around social justice is. And I kind of just want to give you a space to talk about that, however you felt comfortable sharing about that.
Yeah, of course, I'm really passionate about this, and I am an activist, both just in terms of like just showing up on the street in collective action, but also in terms of how I use magic. I feel pretty strongly that we have to sort of choose where we are going to fall, or where we stand relative to power dynamics, right? And I think if you absent yourself from activism, you're basically choosing the status quo. So I'm pretty fierce about that. I believe that, like, witch magical practitioners have access to power, and we should be using it. We should be using it. We should be using it to, bend the moral arc of the universe, so to speak. We should be using it to push against the systems of power that are so unfair and unequal in the society that we exist in. I think that I don't really think it's possible to exist in such an unjust society and time and space without needing to either push back or be basically part of that power structure. I suppose I feel like I'm lecturing a little bit, but I am passionate about this.
I was going to say, this is an area where I will help hopefully, and gladly polish other people's soapboxes. So,
yeah. Yeah, so I do use magic for justice. I mean, people often want to talk about cursing, and I'm far more likely to use cursed magic for purposes of justice than anything personal. I think that's where it really comes into its strength. And just, magic in general, I feel like is one of the tools that we have, and historically it has often been the tool that people turn to when they don't have access to social levers of power. And so there is that history of like, this is something that belongs to the oppressed, and it belongs in the hands of people that are, punching upward. Yeah, that feels important to me.
Me too. So this is kind of a follow-on question, I guess. So what do you think about, like, I feel like this is something I do kind of quietly in my personal work, but I'm also fascinated by these very public organizations of, like, the curse Trump kind of thing. Like, what do you think of those kind of things?
It's a mixed bag. Like, I've seen some of those collective efforts be helpful, and I've seen some of them that I thought were not well designed. So I think, it's a matter of like, what are we trying to accomplish there, and does the effort that's been set up actually match the goal? Sometimes I think they can be more show and sort of self-soothing, or making ourselves feel like we're doing something.
Yeah.
What I want to say is that, like, big national scale public targets are very hard to effectively hit. Because there is this thing where, like, they have all this institutional power upholding them, and that institutional power exists in numinous sense as well as in a social and physical sense. And so you have to contend with all of that. So sometimes, gathering a lot of people together into that effort can be helpful. but only if it's targeted really well and really intelligently.
Yeah.
So it sort of has to be done in a certain way to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that sometimes like those big public efforts, they don't always take into consideration all of the safeguards and like the groundwork that it's helpful to have in place so that cursing is a safe practice for you, because cursing is not sort of inherently in and of itself dangerous, but it can certainly run you afoul of all kinds of things that you want to be prepared for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, blowback can happen. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I know. I think with those big, like you said, like these kind of national targets or institutional things that are big to me, like the cursing, I guess, like you said, could be effective if it's done well, organized well, targeted well. The thing I always think about is an easier approach that is kind of a backdoor thing, is to say, may the truth be revealed. Like, may we really see, what's going on. And that way, I think that does set up an opportunity to have like real world change when people actually see. And I like that approach a lot too.
Especially with people that have a lot of institutional power, it might be more like the curse they don't see coming might be more effective.
Yeah.
So, there's an approach that's like, do it in public and get everybody involved so that it's visible.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an approach that's like, you don't know who I am. You have no idea that this working is happening. And you're just, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And, there are benefits to both approaches, like depending on the situation.
Yeah.
But, like on a person to person level, if I'm going to curse somebody, I'm usually not going to tell them.
Yeah. Well, and I think about it in this like very kind of mundane way of like, everybody's like, it's very important to vote every time, but it's really equally important, if not more so, to vote locally, like in your school board election and your county people and all that. And so maybe that's also where to focus your magic. So it's
easier to have an effect at the local level for sure.
Yeah.
And you also touch on something that I think is really, really important here, which is like magical political action is not something you do instead of getting involved in a, lived day-to-day way.
Right. Yeah.
Those things go together. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really super important, like the spirits and powers that we are trying to call on when we're doing magical action, you need them to take you seriously. You need them to see and acknowledge and trust in your commitment. And one of the ways that we earn that relationship with the spirits is by what we are doing in other areas of our life. Like to what extent our whole lives show that level of commitment. And so, yeah, like show up, not just at the altar, but, in whatever other modes of action are available to you. And that makes all of your magic so much stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, people, when we're recording this, an episode will come out this week where I talked with another guest about, this political action kind of thing. And, people have this idea that you're not an activist if you're not putting yourself in a place where you could be arrested, right? Like if you're not that person on the front line. And I think that's the sexy part. I mean, listeners can't see my scare quotes, but
yeah,
it's this idea that it's all or nothing. You're putting your body on the line, you're putting yourself in danger, or you're not an activist. And I think
there's so much more that goes into that.
Right. And I think that's really something to hammer home to people that, not only is that an ableist approach to activism, it's not helpful, because just like your giant curse work, there's so much has to be in place for that person to be willing and able to put themselves in that whoever can do that, they have to have a network of people behind them.
Yeah. So you're talking about like direct action, you know, street kind of stuff. But like for that to be effective, there's so many other pieces, right? There's funding, there's organizing, there's getting the word out and communications. There's, you know, the people that show up with snacks. First aid
street medics. I was like, there's so much.
Medics, there's jail support, there's bail funds, there's like educational, there's, you know, flyering and canvassing. There's a lot of things, and not all of them involve physical, like on the street labor. Like we need everybody, right? Like these the like people that are holding on to power oppressively, there are less of them than there are of us, right? So like our power is in getting everyone involved that we can. And so I think like we don't want to overlook whatever somebody has to contribute. Everybody's needed. Oh, I think that's a good place to it's a great note to end on, that everybody really is needed, and everybody's needed.
You know, whatever you can contribute is something, and that it is okay to tap out sometimes and rest and come back.
Necessary. Like activist burnout is a real thing, and you know, we need to be in it for the long haul. We need to take care of each other and stand together and support each other. And that means resting when you need to rest.
Awesome. Morpheus, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I'm so glad that you wanted to be on the show, and then we got to talk about this. And since we are practically neighbors, hopefully our paths will continue to cross. So
it's really been a pleasure, and it's great getting to know you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shanekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.